Today we're going to be talking about a very common mistake that people make when they're buying or perhaps building a computer, which is spending too much money on a graphics card and cheaping out on the CPU. So let's go back to the basics for a moment. Inside a computer are many different components, and the most important components from a computer science standpoint is the CPU. It is basically the brain of the computer. It is a microprocessor. I've got a CPU right here. This does the bulk of the processing that takes place in a computer. In fact, some people would go as far as to say that this is the actual computer. You could say that. And then there are many other types of microprocessor inside the computer as well that do all kinds of specific tasks. And one of those is the GPU. GPU stands for Graphics Processing Unit, and its job is to render graphics on the screen of the computer so that we can actually see something. And over the years, the GPU has become more and more important inside your computer, and nowadays the GPU is a hugely important processor, especially if you're running applications that need to render lots of graphics, such as when you're playing a game on a computer. But actually the use of graphics processors has now extended beyond graphics applications. So in a game, obviously you still need a GPU to render those graphics, but also web browsers can now use GPU acceleration. They can use the processing power of the GPU to accelerate web browsing. Video editors can use GPUs to accelerate both the editing and the rendering process, and there are tons of other applications that can now utilize GPU processing power. And so from that point of view, it might make a lot of sense that you spend a lot of money on the GPU and maybe even prioritize it with modern software in mind. But that's not a very good idea. It's important, this is my advice, to prioritize the CPU first. The CPU needs to have the highest priority. Now that doesn't mean that you need to have a CPU that is more expensive than your GPU. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying you should get a CPU that costs more than the GPU that you're going to use, because the GPU can cost more. Actually, this will happen quite often. What I am saying is that you should first pick the CPU that is right for you. So first, before you look at any GPU, you want to make sure that you get the right CPU. So what you do is you take a look at the programs that you're going to run. You see, well, I need a CPU that is like this good for that, for example. What you want to do is buy a CPU that is this good, right? So you want to buy a CPU with some headroom. You want a CPU that is actually overkill for what you're trying to achieve. And then, once you know for sure that you've got this CPU that has plenty of power, definitely, then you can move on and select the GPU and other components. So it's important to pick a good CPU first that is definitely good enough, and then pick the GPU, even if that means that you can spend less money on the GPU and that you can't really get the GPU you wanted originally. Because it's better to have a slightly overkill CPU and a kind of disappointing graphics card than it is to have an overkill graphics card and a kind of disappointing CPU. And there are a bunch of arguments for that. First of all, in many applications, the CPU simply determines the performance, and in this case, video editing is probably the best example I can come up with. If you're video editing on a computer with a very good GPU and CPU, well, obviously that's going to be amazing. If you're video editing on a computer with a bad graphics card but a good CPU, it's going to be acceptable. But if you're video editing on a PC with a bad CPU and a very good graphics card, it's going to be terrible. Right? So a good graphics card is a very nice bonus. The good graphics card can accelerate the video editing a lot and can be a great advantage, but you can only utilize that advantage if you've already got a good CPU in the first place. In other words, you cannot compensate for a lack of CPU power by getting more GPU power. The second argument that I have is that in many cases, GPU bottlenecks, that is, when the performance is bad because of your GPU, can be solved by just changing a bunch of settings. In this case, games are a great example. If I'm in a game and the game is not running smoothly, I have a low FPS for example, and I notice that this is because my graphics card isn't able to render the graphics fast enough, what I can do is sacrifice some visual quality. I can lower the resolution of the game, or I can say, oh, that texture right there, that doesn't have to be so pretty, does it? Just get rid of it. Give me some more frames. Right, so I can sacrifice some visual quality to get more performance. Whereas with a CPU bottleneck, if the game isn't running smoothly because my CPU is not keeping up, there's often not much I can do about that. I can't lower the load on the CPU. There are situations where you can change settings that affect the load on the CPU, but I've noticed from my experience that this, most of the time, it doesn't help. If your CPU isn't good enough, you're not going to have a nice experience running this application, whether it's a game or something else, because you can't really do anything about it. Now, another reason why it's better to have an overkill CPU than an overkill GPU is because, say you have found the problem and now you're going to fix it. You've determined, right, now I'm going to remove this problem, I'm going to replace the part. Now, if the GPU is the problem, then what you do is you order a new graphics card, it arrives the next day, you take out your old card, you shove in the new one, you install a driver, and you're up and running. Right? Your new graphics card is installed, and now your problem is gone. On the other hand, if your CPU is the problem, if that's too slow, you're going to have to replace a CPU. And replacing a CPU is quite a hassle and impossible if you're on a laptop, or maybe on a pre-built. It's also almost impossible because of motherboard compatibility reasons. And so that's just a pain to do. That's a lot of work. And that's if you're lucky, right? Because in most cases, this upgrade isn't going to take place right after you've bought the new system. This upgrade is probably going to happen a few years down the line, which means that the new CPUs are probably not going to fit in your old motherboard anymore because they have a different socket, or maybe they don't have a different socket but you have to update your BIOS to get it to work, or maybe you need to use different memory as well because it uses DDR5 instead of DDR4. So see how I'm future-proofing my videos here? That's great. Anyway, you get all this stuff that you have to deal with. Maybe you even have to replace your entire motherboard in the worst case. And replacing your motherboard also means that Windows, assuming you're using the Windows operating system, is going to classify this as a computer swap. Right? When you swap your motherboard, Windows sees it as getting a new computer, which means you have to reactivate Windows, and that's, in normal English, that means buying Windows once again. And that's not what you want because it's hugely expensive as well. So basically, replacing a CPU is terrible to do, whereas replacing a graphics card is like replacing a USB drive, if you know how to do it. So in conclusion, obviously it's a good thing to have the right balance between the CPU and the graphics card. You shouldn't have an amazing CPU and the worst graphics card in the world, because that's not going to be right either. You always need to try to find the right balance. But what I will tell you is that it's always good to have slightly more money in that CPU. Just make sure you get the CPU right at least, because that is really, really important. Don't cheap out on the CPU. That's basically the advice of this video. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative. And of course, thank you for watching.